On a plantation ruled by iron and cruelty, a decision was made that would echo far beyond its fields. Desperate to preserve his legacy, the master forced a union between his only daughter and one of the enslaved men under his command. She ridiculed all her life for her body, became a pawn in her father's scheme, mocked by neighbors yet suddenly thrust into the center of a story larger than herself. What was meant to secure power instead revealed its fragility. Her weight, once a mark of shame, became a metaphor whispered across the region, the bloated decay of a system collapsing under its own corruption. From burning cane fields to hushed rebellions in the quarters, the tale spread, unsettling masters and igniting hope among the enslaved. This is not a story of romance, but of defiance, of a daughter who could no longer be erased and of a man whose quiet rebellion transformed into legend, shaking an entire order built on chains. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. Dawn broke over the plantation like a golden lie. From a distance, the fields shimmered with promise, endless rows of cane and cotton whispering in the morning wind. The great house sat upon its hill, whitewashed walls gleaming in the sun, a monument to wealth carved from suffering. But step closer, and the illusion faltered. The cries of the overseer cut through the air. The whip cracked. The earth bore the marks of exhaustion, and the people who bent their backs beneath it carried scars both visible and unseen. Inside the grand halls, another story brewed. The plantation owner moved like a sovereign among his subjects, a man who believed his voice carried the weight of law. His word could mean life or death, comfort or torment, and he relished the role. His hands, though soft from years away from fieldwork, still carried the authority of violence. He was a man who saw the world as order, master above, slave below, his family as the living proof of that order's permanence. Yet even within his house, cracks formed in the foundation he clung to. His daughter was one of them. She was large in stature, her body heavy with the weight of both flesh and expectation. Servants whispered behind doors, neighbors laughed in hushed tones at gatherings, and suitors rarely looked her way. To be born the daughter of a master was to inherit privilege, but her body became its own prison. She could not fit the mold of delicate southern womanhood that society demanded. Instead, she bore the brunt of ridicule, her every step watched, her presence whispered about with cruelty sharper than any whip. She moved through the corridors of the great house like a shadow, always present, rarely acknowledged. To her father, she was both disappointment and burden. He spoke of her with impatience, as though her sighs were a deliberate rebellion against him. To her mother, she was a silent grief, a reminder that the family's prestige could not shield them from humiliation. For the enslaved who served in the house, she was a strange figure, neither feared nor respected, but pitied. Caught between power and powerlessness, at meals, she sat in silence as her father spoke of crop yields and neighboring estates, his voice booming with authority, his hands pounding the table to punctuate his own importance. She rarely spoke, and when she did, he cut her off, reminding her of her place even within her own home. She carried herself with a mixture of shame and defiance, knowing she was mocked, yet refusing to disappear entirely. Outside, the plantation thrived on cruelty. Inside, it rotted with secrets. And as the sun rose higher over the fields, illuminating both the suffering of the enslaved and the quiet despair of the daughter, the stage was set. The weight of inheritance pressed on her shoulders, not only the burden of her father's empire, but the burden of a body that made her a target of scorn. No one yet knew that this very weight, this presence so many dismissed, would soon become the lever that shifted the fate of the plantation itself. The plantation awoke each morning before the first light reached the horizon. The fields came alive with the shuffle of bare feet against hard soil, the groans of weary bodies forced into another day of labor. Overseers barked orders with voices like thunder, their whips coiled and ready, reminders of the violence that kept order in place. Every swing, every command carried the weight of fear, and the enslaved people bent beneath it, their backs glistening with sweat long before the sun had fully risen. The land itself seemed to groan under the strain. crops demanding endless toil, generations bound to the soil by chains both seen and unseen. The great house overlooked it all, a looming sentinel of control. Its windows gleamed as though watching the suffering below, yet inside its walls the silence was deafening. The daughter wandered those halls with the heaviness of a ghost, her footsteps muffled on polished wooden floors. She moved through spaces that should have been hers to command, yet she remained an outsider in her own world. Servants bowed their heads when she passed, not out of respect but habit, their eyes avoiding hers. To them she was not a mistress to fear nor a woman to admire, but a presence without power, caught between ridicule and pity. The plantation's rhythms carried on without pause. In the kitchens, enslaved women stirred pots over roaring fires, the air thick with smoke and exhaustion. In the fields, men and women stooped low, their bodies bent like the stalks they harvested. Children too young for the plow carried water to the workers, their small hands trembling under the weight of wooden buckets. The overseers rode their horses slowly between the rows, eyes sharp for any sign of disobedience, the leather in their hands snapping against the air like a constant warning. Life unfolded with a grim predictability, every moment dictated by the master's will. Amid this order, the daughter's presence was both visible and invisible. When she crossed the veranda or appeared in the yard, whispers followed her. Her sighs drew cruel glances, the hidden smirks of house servants, the mocking words of passing field hands who thought she could not hear. Yet there was also a strange hush that came when she appeared, as if her very being disrupted the cruel harmony of the plantation. She did not belong to the rhythm of toil, nor did she hold the authority of her father. She existed in the space between, a reminder that power could isolate as much as it commanded. The plantation thrived on silence, silence of pain swallowed down, silence of fear unspoken, silence of humiliation endured. And as the daughter moved among it, silent herself, her presence carried a weight that no one yet understood. She was both within and apart, part of the master's blood yet never his pride, part of the household yet never its heart. On that silent plantation, her life stretched out like the fields themselves, endless, heavy, waiting for the day when the silence would finally break. The plantation may have been its own kingdom, sealed away by acres of land and guarded by rows of crops, but whispers traveled farther than fences. In neighboring estates and along the roads where carriages passed, talk spread like wildfire. At suppers hosted by wealthy families, at Sunday gatherings after church, and even in the low-lit parlors where men smoked cigars and discussed trade, one subject seemed to linger: the daughter of the master. They spoke of her size first, always her body, as though nothing else about her existed. She was too large, they said, too ungainly, too much for the fragile ideals of Southern womanhood. In a world that prized delicate frames and porcelain appearances, her presence stood as a rebuke. Suitors came once, curious or lured by the promise of inheritance, but they did not stay long. One by one they excused themselves, claiming business elsewhere, or offered polite refusals that could not mask the disgust in their eyes. Her name became a cruel joke on the lips of young men, and even women who hid their own imperfections used her as an example to shield themselves from ridicule. Within the plantation walls, she knew of these whispers. Servants carried fragments of conversations overheard in town, delivering them without meaning to, their lowered gazes betraying what they dared not say aloud. Her mother attempted to shield her, offering small comforts, but even silence could not erase the truth. Each refusal, each absence of a letter, each suitor who turned away was a reminder that she lived in a world where her body was not her own, but an object for others to measure and dismiss. Her father, however, treated the matter differently. To him, her size was not simply a source of shame, but a wound to his pride. Every jest spoken by his peers, every sideways glance at public gatherings, cut into his authority. He saw her not as his daughter but as a liability, a failing that threatened the image of control he cultivated. And so, while neighbors gossiped, his mind churned with calculation. If she could not be wed to a man of standing, then perhaps she could be used in another way, turned into a piece of strategy, a pawn that would serve his will even in disgrace. The daughter felt the weight of it pressing down. She carried herself with quiet defiance, walking through the halls with her head held higher than her heart allowed, but she could not escape the judgment. The air itself seemed to thrum with mockery, the plantation echoing the cruel laughter of the outside world. And though she could not yet see the path her father would lay before her, the whispers had already sealed her fate. In the shadow of shame, her body became not just her burden, but the instrument of a scheme that would shake every life bound to that land. The master of the plantation was a man who measured his worth not only by the land he owned, but by the legacy he believed he would leave behind. Every acre, every crop, every human life bound to his name existed in service of that vision. Yet, behind the polished facade of power, he felt the sting of humiliation growing sharper each year. His daughter, the only child meant to continue his bloodline, remained unmarried. Suitors had vanished, whispers multiplied, and his authority among neighboring planters began to fray. Pride was as vital to him as breath, and the laughter of others cut deeper than any blade. One evening, seated at the head of a long oak table, he made his intentions clear. His voice thundered in the hall, every word sharp as iron. If society would not grant his daughter a place through marriage, then he would carve one himself. He declared that she would be joined, not to a man of wealth or refinement, but to one of his own enslaved men. The room seemed to still at his words, the silence pressing heavy like smoke. To him, this was not shame but strategy. If no gentleman would claim her, then she would still produce heirs, and through them his legacy would survive untarnished. The chosen man was one of the strongest on the plantation, broad-shouldered, hardened by years of labor in the fields. He was known for his endurance, his defiance kept in check only by the constant threat of the whip. To force him into such a union was to strip him of dignity, binding him to a fate neither of his making nor his desire. Yet the master saw only a body fit for breeding, a tool to solve what society mocked as his greatest failure. When word began to spread, it rippled like thunder through the estate. In the quarters, disbelief turned to fury, though it was whispered in hushed tones for fear of reprisal. The enslaved understood the cruelty of labor, the weight of chains, but this decision carried a different horror. It was an act meant to bend both man and daughter into instruments of the master's pride, an unholy bond forged not in love but in control. The daughter herself sat in stunned silence, her face pale as her father's decree echoed in her ears. She had long known shame, but never had it been laid bare so ruthlessly. She was to be bartered like livestock, her body reduced to a vessel for her father's ambitions. She felt the humiliation burn within her, but also something unfamiliar, a flicker of defiance, a quiet rage that simmered beneath the weight of her father's will. Outside, the plantation carried on with its brutal rhythms, yet every heart beat differently that day. Overseers whispered uneasily, neighbors gossiped with fascination, and the enslaved prayed in silence. The master had spoken, and his decision was final. But no decree, however loud, could contain the storm it had unleashed. The announcement was followed by a silence that hung over the plantation like a storm cloud. Days passed, but the shock did not lessen. The man chosen for the master's scheme carried himself with the same strength that had defined him in the fields, but now that strength seemed hollow. His back was straight, his stride firm, yet in his eyes there was a fury chained by circumstance. The decree had robbed him of something more precious than freedom of movement. It had stolen his dignity. To be forced into the master's will, to be bound not by affection but by command, was a bondage that cut deeper than iron shackles. The quarters felt the weight of his shame as much as he did. Other men avoided his gaze, unwilling to meet the silent rage in his eyes. Women shook their heads in sorrow, knowing too well what it meant for a person's body to be claimed as property. Children stared in wide-eyed confusion, hearing fragments of whispered conversations they could not fully understand. The chosen man became both pitied and feared, a figure marked by a cruel fate that could just as easily fall upon any of them. In the great house, The daughter endured her own torment. To her, the decree was a public confession of her father's disdain. For years she had been mocked for her size, judged for her failure to attract a husband. Now her father had confirmed what the world whispered, that she was unworthy of choice, unworthy of love, useful only as a vessel to extend his name. It was humiliation so sharp it hollowed her chest, and yet, within that humiliation was a strange, unwanted release. No longer would she sit waiting for suitors who never came. No longer would she measure herself against the impossible standards whispered in drawing rooms and parlors. Her isolation had been broken, though not in the way she would have chosen. When she crossed paths with the enslaved man in the hall for the first time after the announcement, the air grew heavy. Neither spoke. His jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists at his sides, while she lowered her gaze, unable to meet the fire in his eyes. In that silence lay a truth neither could ignore. Both were victims of the same will, caught in the chains of a man's pride. For him, this union was another form of bondage, a reminder that nothing, not his body, not his spirit, was beyond the master's reach. For her, it was both degradation and a bitter taste of freedom, a break from invisibility that left her exposed and trembling. The plantation seemed to hold its breath as the two figures, bound together by humiliation, walked paths that would soon entangle in ways none had foreseen. Night settled over the plantation with an unsettling stillness, as though the air itself had grown heavy with secrets. The great house, usually filled with the clatter of servants and the low rumble of conversation, fell into an unnatural quiet. Doors creaked softly, footsteps were hushed, and every candle seemed to flicker against the weight of what had been commanded. The master had spoken, and his word had turned the household into a cage of silence. In the servants' quarters, whispers traveled like nervous sparks, faint and hurried, as though the walls themselves were listening. No one dared speak loudly of what had happened, yet everyone knew. They spoke in fragments, half-sentences, and uneasy glances, because to give full voice to their thoughts would have been dangerous. The act had not yet unfolded in its fullness, but the decision alone carried the force of violence. It hung over them all like a curse, reminding them that there was no part of life too sacred for the master to defile. In the fields, families knelt together in the dark, their voices rising only in prayer. Some prayed for protection, others for deliverance, and a few for the downfall of the man whose power twisted lives to serve his vanity. Mothers pulled their children close, shielding young ears from the truths that crept through the air. Fathers clenched their hands into fists, unable to act, forced to bury their anger in the soil beneath them. For the enslaved, this was not only the humiliation of one man, but the humiliation of all, a reminder that none were safe from the master's reach. Inside the main house, the daughter lay awake in her chamber, staring at the ceiling as shadows danced across the walls. She felt the silence pressing in on her, a silence louder than any ridicule she had ever endured. Her body burned with humiliation, yet beneath that shame lingered an unspoken awareness. Something had shifted. The ridicule that had once isolated her was now replaced by a terrible kind of notice. She was no longer invisible, but she was not free. The man chosen for her sat alone in his own space, the night around him thick with rage. He did not sleep. He could not. The silence that enveloped the plantation was different for him. It was a silence of chains tightening, of dignity stolen, of manhood twisted into the master's weapon. He knew that when morning came, nothing would be as it was before. Overseers moved through the corridors with unease, their eyes lowered, their mouths shut. They enforced the master's will with brutality, yet even they avoided speaking of it. The house held its breath, the land held its silence, and all who lived there felt the shift. Though no one spoke it aloud, the act had already begun to unravel the fabric of the plantation. It was a night that would not be forgotten, a silence that carried the weight of thunder waiting to break. The morning after the master's decree, the plantation did not look different, yet something unseen had altered the air. The sun still rose over the rows of cane, the overseers still barked orders, and the enslaved still bent beneath the weight of their tasks. But in the house, In the quarters, and even beyond the fences, there was a new current flowing. At its center was the daughter, the one who for so long had been the subject of mockery whispered behind fans and in shaded corners. Now she was spoken of in another tone, not simply with ridicule but with unease, with a quiet fascination that followed her wherever she went. She felt it first in the eyes of the servants, where before they looked past her, barely acknowledging her presence except when duty required it. Now their gazes lingered. Some looked with pity, some with fear, others with a curiosity they dared not voice. In their silence, she sensed a shift. She was no longer the invisible daughter, too large to be considered a proper lady. She had become something else, a figure that unsettled the order of the plantation. At the breakfast table, her father spoke with the same booming authority as always, but she noticed how even the overseers avoided her eyes. Their deference was not respect, but caution. They knew what had been commanded. And though they did not speak it aloud, they carried the knowledge in their every gesture. For once, she was not an afterthought. She was the subject of thought itself, heavy in the minds of those around her. The realization unsettled her. Shame still clung to her like a second skin, and yet, beneath it, another feeling stirred. For years she had been ridiculed for her size, cast aside as though her existence were an embarrassment to her family. But now, no one could ignore her. They could not dismiss her presence. They could not laugh her away. The scandal that surrounded her had forced them to look, to speak, to acknowledge. For the first time, she felt the strange weight of influence. She walked through the halls differently that day. Her steps were slower, more deliberate, as though testing the ground beneath her feet. She did not mistake this new attention for respect, but she recognized its power. Fear had touched her name, and fascination had taken root where mockery once bloomed. It was a bitter kind of awakening, born not from triumph but from humiliation, yet it was awakening all the same. As night fell and she stood at her window overlooking the fields, she understood that the plantation would never see her in the same way again. The ridicule of the past had not vanished, but it had been joined by something sharper. Her body, once only a subject of derision, had become a symbol in a story larger than herself. And though she had not chosen it, she felt the shift inside her, the first stirrings of a voice she had never known she possessed. The man chosen by the master walked the plantation with a heaviness that went deeper than muscle or bone. His frame was broad, his arms hardened by years of work in the fields, yet strength had never felt so useless. He had known chains of iron, the sting of the whip, the weight of forced labor. But this command was different. It was not the bending of his back in the sun, it was the bending of his very existence to the will of another. He had been made into a tool, not for the harvest of crops but for the preservation of the master's pride. Fury burned inside him like a hidden fire. Every glance from an overseer, every whisper from the quarters, every reminder of what had been decreed, only fed the flames. Yet he did not let that fury consume him recklessly. He knew the cost of anger unshaped. Too many had been broken for acts of defiance born in haste. His rage would not be wasted in a single outburst. He would carry it, study it, and turn it into something that might strike deeper than a whip ever could. At night he lay awake, staring into the dark, hearing the restless movements of others around him. He knew they were watching, waiting, measuring him against the role forced upon him. Some pitied him, others feared what might come of it, but all understood that his fate had become a matter tied to theirs. His humiliation was not his alone. In him they saw the cruel reach of the master's power, a reach that could twist any life to serve its purpose. Yet they also looked to him with a silent question. Would he endure it quietly? Or would he make it mean something more? The daughter herself crossed his mind often, not with affection but with recognition. She too had been forced into this arrangement, humiliated in her own way, though her chains were gilded and hers carried the weight of privilege. He did not mistake her burden for his, but he saw the strange truth that bound them. They were both being used, both stripped of choice. In that, a sliver of possibility revealed itself. Opportunity came not from desire but from circumstance. If the master believed this union secured his legacy, then perhaps it could be turned against him. Perhaps it could unravel the very authority he clung to. The man felt the stirrings of resolve take shape, cold and deliberate. His body was not his own, but his will still burned. And if he chose carefully, his actions could rattle the walls of the house, seep into the fields, and shake the order of the plantation to its roots. The plantation breathed uneasily, as though every wall and field carried the weight of secrets that no one dared speak aloud in the open. The arrangement between the master's daughter and the enslaved man had spread like smoke, seeping into every corner of the estate. In the cabins, whispers stirred after nightfall, voices low, words half-formed, carrying both fear and possibility. Some called it shame, others called it a sign, and a few dared to suggest it might be the spark they had been waiting for. By day the whispers showed themselves in glances. Men bent over hoes in the furrows looked up too often, their eyes flicking to the big house as if it contained some hidden storm. Women carrying baskets of laundry lingered near one another, their conversations breaking off suddenly whenever an overseer passed. The air held a tension thicker than summer humidity, a sense that the order everyone had known was shifting, though no one could yet say where it would lead. The overseers felt it first in their bones, the unease that comes when obedience grows too quiet, too brittle. They tightened their grip, walking the fields with whips in hand more often, barking orders with harsher tones. Yet even as they struck, they sensed that fear was no longer flowing as it once had. Something had been unsettled, and they did not know how to contain it. Inside the house, the mistress drifted like a ghost. She had endured her husband's cruelty for years, but this decision broke something fragile within her. The thought of her daughter bound to a man she considered beneath their station filled her with despair she could not disguise. She withdrew from meals, pacing the corridors with restless steps, her hands trembling as if the very foundation of her life had come loose. The servants whispered that she wept behind closed doors, her cries muffled by heavy curtains, yet heard all the same. The daughter herself felt the weight of eyes upon her wherever she went. Where once people had mocked her openly or dismissed her presence altogether, now they regarded her with a wary silence. Fear, fascination, and resentment blended into the way voices faltered when she entered a room. For the first time, she was at the center of the plantation's story, and the attention was both intoxicating and suffocating. Every corner of the estate seemed to hum with an unspoken question. Was this union merely the master's madness? Or was it the opening of a door that had always been locked? In the dark, when whispers became bold, some spoke of rebellion. Others warned that rebellion meant blood. And still, the murmurs grew, restless and unstoppable, like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. The gossip carried itself beyond the fences of the plantation, slipping down dirt roads and across town squares until it became something alive, something cruel. People who had never set foot on the estate spoke of the master's daughter as though she were not a person but a cautionary tale. Her body became a symbol upon which outsiders painted their mockery. They said the plantation itself was swollen like her, bloated by greed, corrupted by arrogance, and ready to collapse under the weight of its own excess. In taverns and shops, men laughed over their mugs, describing her size with vulgar exaggerations. Women whispered in corners, shaking their heads at the scandal of it all, claiming that the master's desperation had driven him to madness. The cruelest voices claimed that the family's downfall had begun the moment they bound the daughter to a man in chains. What should have remained private had become a spectacle, and each retelling distorted her further, until she was no longer flesh and blood but an emblem of decay. Within the plantation gates, the echoes of that gossip stung like lashes. Overseers carried the news back from town, unable to keep it from their tongues, and the enslaved heard the words too, repeating them in hushed tones when they thought no one else was listening. Even those who pitied her found themselves caught in the rhythm of the rumor, using her size as a metaphor for the rot spreading through the master's rule. The plantation, they said, was crumbling like an overfed body, staggering toward collapse. The daughter bore this weight in silence. She had always been aware of the way others saw her, of the ridicule tucked into every glance. But now it was sharper, more pointed, for she was not only mocked for her body but transformed into the embodiment of her father's decline. She became a mirror in which the failures of the estate were reflected, a walking reminder of greed and corruption. And though the cruelty wounded her, it also shifted something deep inside. For the first time, she understood that her presence alone carried power, even if born of scorn. The master raged when he heard the talk. He struck the walls with his fists, cursing the town, cursing his neighbors, but even he knew that gossip could not be silenced. The whispers were louder than any whip, spreading beyond his reach, undermining his authority with every retold jest. His daughter had become something he had never intended, something no one could control. A symbol, and in that symbol lay both humiliation and the faint, dangerous possibility of change. The rhythm of the fields had always been measured by submission. Backs bent, voices muted, movements quickened at the crack of the overseer's whip. Yet something in that rhythm began to falter when the man chosen by the master started to shift his steps. At first it was small, so small it seemed almost careless. A tool held just a moment too long before it struck the earth. A basket set down with deliberate slowness. The overseers noticed, their tempers sparking, but when they barked at him, he did not scramble as the others did. He lifted his eyes, stared at them full, and the crack of their voices seemed to lose some of its sting. He had never been known for disobedience. Strength, yes. Endurance, yes. Quiet endurance that could carry bales of cotton longer than most men. But now his silence was no longer passive. It was a statement. He refused to bow his head when addressed, meeting the overseer's eyes in a way that unsettled them. They threatened him, shouted in his face, yet they hesitated at the final step. For they knew whose house he now entered, whose company he now kept. The connection to the daughter hung like an invisible shield around him. It was not affection that gave him power but association. To strike him too hard, to punish him too openly, risked angering the master in unpredictable ways. And so the overseers fumed, their whips twitching in their hands, but they turned away more often than they struck. This subtle immunity spread through the quarters like a quiet fire. Others watched him carefully. Some feared that his defiance would bring ruin upon them all, that the master's wrath would fall heavier when it came. But others felt a thrill of something long dormant. If he could stare into the eyes of power and not flinch, perhaps there was more space for resistance than they had believed. His every refusal, small though it seemed, became a signal. His steps slowed the rhythm of the fields, and others began to notice how heavy silence could be when it was chosen, not imposed. At night, when the quarters filled with low voices and weary bodies, his name was whispered with something between caution and admiration. He had not struck a blow, yet he had unsettled the very balance of fear. The master had meant to use him as a tool, to humiliate him into submission, but instead, he had become a figure of quiet defiance. And though the man himself bore the weight of it with measured calm, he knew that his choices were beginning to ripple far beyond himself. The master's fury had no boundary. It seethed through him like a fever, spilling out in shouts that echoed across the fields and strikes that left welts on skin. Every whisper of disobedience, every glance he thought lingered too long, became proof of betrayal. He had always ruled with severity, but now it sharpened into cruelty, a desperate attempt to smother the unrest he could feel rising like heat from the ground. He stormed through the quarters without warning, dragging men from their beds, demanding explanations for imagined offenses. Women were struck for failing to move quickly enough, children whipped for crying too loudly. The overseers, emboldened by his wrath, unleashed their own violence more freely, yet beneath their viciousness lay unease. They too saw how his control slipped with every punishment, how fear no longer held as firmly as it once did. The chosen man bore the brunt of his anger most often. The master's eyes narrowed whenever he crossed the yard, and though the blows fell hard, there was always a limit. The overseers dared not push too far, for the man was tied to the daughter now, and the master's own scheme had made him more than just another enslaved body. This contradiction gnawed at the master's pride. He wanted obedience, absolute and unquestioned, yet he himself had weakened the chains he relied upon. The daughter watched these eruptions from the shadows of the house. She saw her father's face redden with rage, saw the way his hands trembled when his authority was not met with instant submission. She had lived under his rule all her life, yet she had never seen him so frayed, so desperate. It unsettled her and, in some buried place, gave her a strange sense of release. The weight of his power was shifting, and though the change was terrifying, it also held the promise of something beyond his reach. The plantation itself groaned under the strain. Work faltered. Songs once sung in rhythm were silenced, leaving only the thud of tools and the hiss of whips. Yet beneath the silence, something stronger gathered. The enslaved knew the master's rage came not from strength, but from fear. Each strike, each cruel word, each punishment revealed cracks in the foundation of his rule. By nightfall, the air was thick with tension, but it was no longer only dread. The master thought his violence kept the order intact, but with every outburst, he fed the quiet belief that his reign was unraveling. The more he lashed out, the more his authority slipped through his hands like sand. The night carried a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the land itself waited for something to happen. The moon hung heavy over the fields, silver light spreading across the rows of cotton like a shroud. The enslaved man had carried his fury in silence for weeks, measuring each breath, each step, until it became clear that silence itself was no longer enough. He would not raise a hand in violence that would only give the master an excuse to crush him, but he would act in a way that the plantation could not ignore. It was during the evening meal, when the family gathered in the grand dining hall and servants moved quietly around the table. The master sat tall in his chair, his voice booming with authority, speaking of crops and debts, pretending the world beyond those walls did not tremble with gossip about his name. The daughter sat in silence, her hands folded, her eyes cast downward, while the mistress seemed only half present, staring into the distance as though her spirit had drifted from her body. Then the enslaved man entered. He had been ordered to stand nearby, ready to serve if called upon. But instead of waiting at the wall like a shadow, he crossed the room with a calmness that froze every other servant in place. He stepped to the table itself, and without asking, without bowing, he placed a pitcher of water directly before the master. It was a small act, yet in its simplicity lay thunder. For in that gesture he had broken the invisible rule that kept him beneath them. He had served not as a slave, but as though he were an equal. The master's face flushed red, his fist tightening around his cup. The room seemed to stop breathing. To strike the man now, in front of his daughter and wife, would be to admit weakness, to acknowledge that the act had pierced his pride. Yet to ignore it was worse, for silence gave the gesture weight. The daughter lifted her eyes, truly seeing for the first time. She had lived under her father's shadow all her life, believing his control absolute, but here was proof that his power could be unsettled without a whip, without a shout, only a single act of defiance. She felt a stirring in her chest, confusion and fear tangled with something she could not name. The enslaved man stood motionless, his face unreadable, but his eyes burned with a calm fire that everyone in the room felt. The master finally slammed his hand against the table, rattling the dishes, but no words came. The silence that followed was louder than rage, for it declared that his authority had been touched, and the entire plantation would feel its echo. The daughter had lived her entire life beneath the weight of ridicule, shrinking inward each time she caught the glances of neighbors or the sneers of her father's guests. Her body had always been a subject of whispers, a source of shame that no silken dress or gilded necklace could disguise. She had learned to walk quietly, to occupy as little space as possible despite the size of her frame, to hope invisibility might shield her from judgment. Yet now she found herself unable to fade. For the first time, she was at the center of everything, and the feeling unsettled her more than she could admit. The act at the dining table replayed in her mind with relentless clarity. She had seen her father's rage, the trembling in his hands, the silence that robbed him of words. And she had seen the enslaved man's eyes, calm yet defiant, unyielding in a way that unsettled her. That moment struck her deeper than she expected, not simply because it humiliated her father, but because it revealed something she had never imagined, that power was not as solid as she had been raised to believe. Her heart wrestled with itself in the days that followed. She had been taught that those in chains were lesser, beings made to serve, but nothing about the man reflected weakness. Instead, he carried himself with a dignity that defied every cruel story her father had ever told. She remembered the nights she had wept alone, feeling like an outcast in her own home, mocked and unwanted, and though his suffering was far greater, she recognized in him a loneliness that mirrored her own. For the first time, she began to see him not as the role her father forced upon him, but as a man, one who bore humiliation with a strength she could not fathom. This recognition unsettled her. It made her question the walls of the house she lived in, the rules that dictated every breath of her life. If her father could command such a cruel arrangement, if he could wield power with no regard for the hearts of those bound beneath him, then what else about the world he had built was false? At night, she lay awake listening to the sounds of the plantation, the distant cries, the chains, the whispers carried on the wind. They no longer blended into the background as they once had. Now they pressed against her chest, demanding that she see them for what they were. And though she did not yet understand what her sympathy meant, or where it might lead her, she could not escape the truth that something inside her had shifted. For the first time, she looked at her father's empire not with fear or awe, but with doubt. The night it began was thick with heat, the kind that clung to the skin and turned every breath into labor. The cane fields stretched into the distance like a dark sea, silent but restless, as though they had been waiting for years to be touched by flame. The enslaved had whispered for weeks, their voices carrying beneath the crack of whips and the commands of overseers. They had seen the master's grip weaken, had felt the tremors of defiance when one of their own dared humiliate him before his own table. And though fear still chained them, courage now lingered close, daring them to act. It started with a flicker, no larger than a candle flame, hidden deep in the rows where no overseer's eyes lingered at night. The fire caught the dry stalks greedily, growing faster than the hand that lit it could have hoped. By the time the orange glow rose into the sky, it was too late to stop. The cane burned like kindling, the stalks cracking and hissing as sparks leapt to new patches. The fields, which had fed the master's fortune for decades, became a raging testament to rebellion. The enslaved did not flee in terror, as they had been taught to do at the sound of fire. Instead, they stood in shadows at the edge of the fields, their faces lit by the blaze, eyes wide with something like wonder. The inferno was not just destruction, it was a message. The master could punish them, he could lash and starve them, but he could not unburn the cane. He could not rebuild quickly what had been torn down in a single night. The overseers scrambled, shouting, their silhouettes darting back and forth as they tried to form lines of defense with buckets of water that did little more than hiss against the fire's hunger. The master himself stormed from the big house, his voice booming, his threats lost in the roar of burning fields. He bellowed orders no one could follow, waving his fists at the dark sky as though rage alone could stop the flames. The daughter watched from an upstairs window, the reflection of fire dancing in her eyes. Her father's empire, the world that had trapped her in shame and silence, now glowed red with ruin. And though fear twisted in her stomach, there was also something else, a deep recognition that this was not just chaos but consequence. She had begun to question the world her father built, and now the land itself seemed to echo those questions in fire. In the quarters, whispers grew louder. Some feared what would come at dawn, the punishments that would rain down. Others, emboldened, spoke of this as the first step, a declaration that they were no longer powerless. The enslaved man moved among them quietly, his presence enough to steady those whose courage wavered. He did not claim the fire as his doing, nor did he need to. The act belonged to all of them, to the years of pain that had smoldered until they finally erupted in flame. By morning, smoke hung heavy over the plantation. Entire sections of the cane were reduced to ash, blackened stalks jutting from the soil like bones. The master's fury was unrestrained, his punishments brutal, yet even in violence his power seemed smaller, swallowed by the charred fields around him. The plantation no longer felt invincible. It teetered now, fragile, as though one more act of defiance might bring the entire empire crashing down. The smoke from the burned cane still lingered in the air, clinging to clothes, hair, and skin. It seeped into the walls of the house and hung heavy over the quarters, an unshakable reminder of what had happened. The plantation had been wounded, and though the master shouted, whipped, and cursed in his fury, everyone could see that the land itself bore scars that no punishment could erase. Out of that smoke rose a strange new figure, not in the fields or among the overseers, but within the walls of the house itself. The daughter, long mocked and dismissed, became something no one had expected. She had always felt the weight of her own body as a burden, carrying shame with every step. Her sighs had been the subject of laughter, of whispers behind fans, of cruel names spoken with smirks. But now, that same body had become a different kind of weight. The enslaved, whispering in the shadows, spoke of her not as the butt of ridicule but as a sign. Her father's obsession with binding her to one of their strongest had turned against him. In her presence, they saw the cracks in the master's house, the proof that his control was not absolute. Her very existence, once hidden in shame, was now proof that even the most powerful man on the plantation could falter. In the quarters, the whispers grew into stories. Some said she carried the curse of her father's greed, that her size was the reflection of his corruption. Others said she was unknowingly part of their deliverance, the weakness he himself had planted within his family. Whatever the words, her image became more than flesh. She had been transformed into a symbol of his failing empire, the living embodiment of its decay. The master, however, saw her differently. Each time he looked upon her, he saw not a daughter but a betrayal. He could not separate her from the defiance that had spread across the land. In his eyes, she was the reason the enslaved had grown bolder, the reason whispers had turned to fire. The more he raged, the more he turned his fury toward her in bitter glares and cruel words. He accused her of weakness, of bringing shame into his home, of being the reason his authority slipped like water through his fists. Where once he had ridiculed her size in passing, now he hurled it as a weapon, calling her the swollen image of his ruin. She bore these words in silence, but inside, something shifted. For the first time, she did not absorb her father's cruelty as truth. She saw that his anger came not from her body but from his own fear, from the cracks spreading through his empire. What he named betrayal was, in truth, his own creation. She had not chosen to become a symbol, but she could not escape the role forced upon her. When she walked through the plantation now, eyes followed her differently. Servants who once smirked behind her back looked with wary respect. Overseers glanced quickly away. The enslaved regarded her with a strange mixture of pity and recognition, as though they saw in her the same weight they carried, though shaped in another form. She was no hero, no rebel leader. Yet she had become a sign that the master's house was no longer whole. The daughter, once hidden in shame, now carried a weight far heavier than her body. She carried the weight of rebellion, pressed upon her by both those who hated her and those who hoped through her. And with every step she took, the foundation of her father's world seemed to tremble just a little more. The day of confrontation came without warning, though in truth it had been building for weeks. The cane fields still lay scarred, blackened stalks jutting from the soil like the bones of a broken beast. The overseers had grown harsher, the master more volatile, yet obedience was no longer unquestioned. In the quarters, whispers had hardened into conviction, and even the walls of the great house seemed to carry the echo of unrest. All of it led to the moment when silence finally shattered, when the enslaved man no longer carried his defiance in quiet gestures but brought it into the open for all to see. It happened in the yard, where the master stood barking orders, his voice raw from rage and exhaustion. Workers had been dragged from their tasks to listen to his tirade. He accused them of idleness, of sabotage, of treachery festering in the soil itself. His words were poison, yet they carried less weight than before. Men and women stood in sullen silence, their eyes fixed not on the master but on one another, as if waiting for someone to give shape to the thoughts they dared not speak aloud. The enslaved man stepped forward. He did not bow his head or shuffle his feet in the manner expected. He stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, his eyes locked on the master's face. A hush swept through the gathered crowd, overseers tightening their grip on whips and rifles. The air thickened with tension, the moment teetering on the edge of violence. When he spoke, his voice was steady, carrying across the yard like a bell. He did not beg. He did not curse. He asked a question, one that cut deeper than any blade. He asked the master what kind of ruler needed to chain his own daughter's life to a man he enslaved. The words struck like thunder, laying bare the shame everyone knew, but none had dared to voice aloud. The master's face contorted, his hands trembling as he reached for his cane. He spat curses, his voice cracking under the strain of fury. He shouted that no one questioned his authority, that he was lord of the land, owner of every body that stood before him. Yet the crowd heard something else in his cries. They heard the shrill edge of desperation, the sound of a man no longer certain his power would hold. The enslaved man did not back down. He took another step forward, his gaze unwavering, and spoke again. He said the plantation no longer belonged to the master's will alone, that the land itself had begun to reject him, that even his family bore the cracks of his cruelty. Each word carried the weight of truth, and each truth stole breath from the master's lungs. The daughter stood at an upstairs window, frozen as she watched. Her heart pounded at the sight of her father, once untouchable, unraveling beneath the strength of words alone. The enslaved man had raised no weapon, spilled no blood, yet he had turned the plantation into a battlefield. The overseers held their whips but hesitated, sensing that striking now might ignite something they could not contain. The yard pulsed with silence, thick and unbreakable. Authority, once clear and sharp, now blurred before their eyes. For the first time, the master's throne of fear trembled beneath him, and the enslaved man stood before him not as property, but as a rival. And all who watched knew that nothing on the plantation would ever be the same again. The plantation no longer breathed in rhythm. What had once been a place of strict order, where every sound of the whip and every call of command kept labor moving like clockwork, now faltered under the weight of unrest. The fields that had once stretched green and full now lay scarred with ash and neglect. The cane that survived the fire grew in wild, uneven patches, untended and unruly, while weeds crept through the rows as if mocking the master's loss of control. The overseers, once the iron backbone of the plantation, began to scatter. Some left in fear, unwilling to remain on land that seemed cursed by rebellion. Others fled after skirmishes with the enslaved, their authority broken in small but decisive moments. Whips cracked less often, rifles were carried with trembling hands, and the sound of boots no longer carried confidence but hesitation. The very men who had once enforced obedience now looked over their shoulders, uncertain of which shadow might rise against them. Within the big house, the master's rage grew more frantic. His shouts echoed through the halls, demanding order, demanding loyalty, demanding the return of the fear that had once bent every back to his will. Yet his commands were met with silence more often than obedience. Servants moved slowly, their eyes avoiding his, while the enslaved in the quarters obeyed only enough to avoid immediate punishment. The absolute control he had once wielded had slipped, and no amount of violence could fully reclaim it. The daughter felt the shift most clearly. She moved through the house with a strange new awareness, noticing how the servants no longer whispered mockery when she passed, but instead looked at her as though she were caught between two worlds. To them, she was still the master's blood, but she was also the evidence of his weakening hold. Her presence, once the subject of ridicule, had become a reminder that the man who ruled them was no longer untouchable. The mistress sank further into despair. She wandered the halls like a fated spirit, clutching rosary beads in trembling hands, whispering prayers that went unanswered. She no longer tried to control her husband's rages or her daughter's silent defiance. It was as if she, too, had surrendered to the collapse, drifting through the ruins of a life she once believed secure. The enslaved felt the change like air after a storm. Fear had not vanished, but it no longer crushed them as it once did. In the evenings, when fires burned low in the quarters, voices rose louder than before. Songs, once hushed, returned in fragments. Conversations carried the weight of hope, cautious yet undeniable. They knew the master's grip was slipping, and with it came the dangerous possibility that something new might rise in its place. The master stood often on the porch of the big house, staring out at the fields that no longer bent to his command. His eyes were hollow, his hands shaking though he tried to steady them on the railing. The land he had ruled like a king now mocked him with every patch of wild growth, every overseer who vanished, every whisper he could not silence. The empire he built was unraveling before his eyes, and the harder he tried to clutch it, the faster it slipped through his fingers. The plantation, once a monument to his power, now stood as a monument to its collapse. The system he had lived and killed to preserve was crumbling, and all who lived upon the land could feel the tremor of its fall. The halls of the big house echoed with her footsteps. Once they had been filled with noise, the shuffle of servants, the booming voice of her father, the whispers of her mother trying to keep the peace. Now they stood hollow, every creak of the floorboards a reminder of what had been lost. Dust gathered in corners, curtains sagged heavy with neglect, and the air hung thick, as though the house itself mourned the collapse of its authority. The daughter walked slowly through those spaces, her body no longer hidden behind lowered eyes or shameful glances. She had grown up inside these walls, mocked, pitied, and dismissed. The town had always spoken of her as if her size were a curse, a sign of her family's corruption, something to laugh at behind closed doors. But now, those same voices had turned sharp, bitter with resentment. Neighbors whispered her name not as an object of ridicule but as the living symbol of her father's downfall. To them, she was the embodiment of humiliation, the reminder that the once feared master had lost everything. And yet, she carried herself differently. The shame that had haunted her for years no longer bound her. For the first time, she understood that her body, her presence, had undone the empire her father tried to build. It was not strength of whip or command that had broken him, but the truth that his own desperate scheme had unraveled his authority. She had been used as a pawn, forced into a union that was meant to preserve his power, yet in the end, it was that very act which shattered it. When she looked into the mirrors scattered across the house, she did not flinch. The woman staring back at her was no longer the awkward, ridiculed girl who had once cowered beneath cruel words. She saw the weight she carried as something beyond ridicule. It was history etched into flesh, a living reminder of how fragile power could be. Neighbors might despise her. Servants might avoid her. But she had stepped into a truth greater than their scorn. Outside, the land lay in ruin. Fields grew wild where Cain had once stood in rigid rows, overseers had abandoned their posts, and the enslaved carried themselves with new defiance. Some had already fled, disappearing into the forests and swamps, while others lingered, waiting to see what freedom might mean in the shadow of collapse. The plantation no longer belonged to anyone, not truly. It was neither the master's empire nor the orderly prison it had once been. It was a shell, haunted by memories of chains and commands. The daughter moved among those ruins with a strange calm. She felt the stares when she ventured beyond the estate. Townsfolk crossed the road to avoid her, their gossip louder than ever, their sneers sharpened with the satisfaction of seeing the master's bloodline humiliated. But she did not bow her head. Each whisper was proof that the story of her father's dominion had ended, and she, the one they had mocked most cruelly, was the one left standing among the ashes. At night she sat alone in the grand hall, candles burning low, her shadow stretching across the cracked floor. The silence no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like a reckoning. The house was not hers, nor was it her father's any longer. It belonged to memory, to shame, to the slow erosion of power that had once seemed eternal. She understood that she would never escape the whispers. Her name, her body, her very existence would forever be tied to the collapse of the estate. But she no longer feared it. Legacy was no longer about what her father built, but what had crumbled because of him. And in that collapse, she found something unexpected, not freedom, not peace, but a strange, unyielding strength. The daughter walked the halls of the empty house with her head unbowed, carrying the weight of shame as if it were a crown. The scandal did not remain contained within the crumbling walls of the estate. Like fire carried on dry wind, it spread from mouth to mouth, road to road, until the entire region trembled with the telling. At first it was spoken in whispers, cautious and uncertain, but soon it became louder, a tale too irresistible to be buried. The neighbors who had once mocked the daughter's size now spoke her name with venom, unable to erase the humiliation the story carried. They said her father had gambled with his legacy and lost, that he had shackled his daughter's life to a man he sought to control, only to find his own house destroyed in the process. The other planters reacted with terror disguised as authority. Overseers were armed more heavily, punishments grew harsher, and laws were repeated like incantations meant to hold back an unseen storm. The very idea that an enslaved man, once broken under command, had stood in public defiance and left a master silenced unsettled them in ways they dared not admit. That a daughter, mocked for her body and dismissed as weak, had become the unwilling symbol of that defiance made the story more dangerous still. It was not merely rebellion by force, it was rebellion of meaning, of narrative, of perception. If one plantation could unravel under the weight of its own cruelty, then all of them might. The enslaved whispered with new intensity. In quarters across the South, the story was carried and reshaped. Some spoke of the man as a hero who had bent the master's will without lifting a blade. Others told it as a parable of how even the overlooked and ridiculed could shake the world's order. Around fires at night, the tale grew into legend, embroidered with symbols, retold with hope. The daughter became an emblem too, not beloved, not admired, but remembered as the one whose very existence marked the fault lines of power. For the planter class, her name became a curse. At gatherings, they avoided speaking of it directly, yet the fear lingered in their eyes. They saw in their daughters, in their sons, the fragility of the systems they claimed were eternal. They tightened their grips on land, on flesh, on power, but no lash or chain could erase the fact that one of their own had fallen not by invasion from outside but from collapse within. The daughter herself walked among these echoes with a strange detachment. She did not seek to correct the stories, nor defend her name. She let the whispers swirl as they pleased. She had lived her entire life ridiculed, and now the ridicule had turned into legend. Her shame had been transformed into something larger than her, something neither her father nor the town could control. For once, she was not invisible. She was unforgettable. The plantation became a monument of ruin. Vines swallowed the fences, the fields went untended, and the grand house stood as a hollow reminder of what had been lost. Travelers passing by pointed to it, retelling the scandal with either laughter or awe, never knowing the full truth but repeating enough to keep it alive. Children who had not been born during the collapse grew up hearing of the day a master's pride was broken by the very union he forced. And so the story endured. It echoed beyond the fields, across counties, across generations, shaping the way people spoke of power, of cruelty, of fragility. The enslaved carried it as a seed of defiance, the masters as a warning of shame. In the end, it no longer belonged to the daughter or the man, or even the master who lost everything. It belonged to memory itself. Long after the halls had rotted and the fields lay wild, people still told it the tale of how an obese daughter and an enslaved man shook not just a household, but an entire system built on domination. It lived on as a reminder that even the heaviest chains could fracture when the truth, no matter how unlikely, demanded to be seen.